On Christmas Eve, young Clara receives the gift of a nutcracker from her uncle Drosselmeyer. But there's more to the nutcracker than meets the eye. That night, an army of mice invade Clara's living room. All the dolls, including the nutcracker, come to life and the battle begins. The dolls are victorious when Clara hits the Mouse King on the head, and the nutcracker becomes a handsome prince who whisks her away through the snowy night to the land of sweets, where Clara meets the Sugar Plum Fairy and her cavalier. In thanks for defeating the Mouse King, there is a great celebration with dancing sweets. There's chocolate from Spain, tea from China, coffee from Arabia, Russian candy canes, and French marzipan. But soon the night is at an end, and Clara must go home, where she wakes up in her bed to discover it was only a dream. Or was it? The story of Clara and her voyage to the land of sweets is full of color and imagination. And I hope today, as we explore how the Nutcracker became an American tradition, I can take you on a voyage equally as imaginative and colorful. So let's begin. The gift of a nutcracker is an old German folk tradition. A nutcracker was given as a keepsake and a symbol of good luck. It dates back to an ancestral tradition of bringing whimsical nutcrackers to dinner to use as a conversational piece, as guests gathered together after the meal, cracking nuts for dessert. Of course, for many, Christmas just wouldn't be Christmas without the nutcracker. And it's not just about the ballet. The iconic music fills our commercials and our stores every holiday season. And even if you haven't seen the Nutcracker ballet, you probably know the name of its composer, Tchaikovsky. That being said, of the 800 plus Nutcracker ballets that were performed last year worldwide, over 700 of those ballets were performed right here in the United States. So what has made a rather dark and gloomy 18th century German novel transform itself first into a Russian ballet and then into an American tradition? Let's find out. ABBA has a dancing queen, but France had a dancing king. This is Louis XIV, who holds to this day the record as the longest reigning monarch in Europe. Louis's power was so absolute, he took the name of the Sun King. During his long and turbulent life, he strove for magnificence in all things, including dancing. In 1653, he performed 12 hours in Ballet de la Nuit, Ballet of the Night, which began in the dark before sunrise and ended with the sunset in a finale in which Louis was lifted away in a flying chariot. Louis XIV didn't invent ballet, which in his time was a system of court dances from Italy in which all the nobility trained. But when he was a boy, there'd been a coup in France. Louis and his mother were forced to flee Paris. This taught Louis to fear a nobility with time on their hands. Creating ever new dances kept the nobility busy learning them in order to appear fashionable and influential. Think of it as the social media trend of the 17th century. But while he didn't invent ballet, he did codify it and develop it into the theatrical form of art that we have today, primarily by founding the first ballet school in the Western world in March 1661. The Académie Royale de Danse is where many ballet steps were named and formed. Along with his teacher, Pierre Beauchamp, Louis famously created the 5 ballet positions still found in classes around the world today. In fact, here is a portrait Louis had painted of himself in 4th position. This became his official portrait and still hangs in the Palace of Versailles. The king was aging when this portrait was painted. What I love about it is that while his coronation robes are draped over an ever-expanding belly, they reveal a rather nice pair of legs shaped by years of dancing. The French Revolution brought many changes to the world of ballet. As the absolute monarchy was rejected, the themes of dance began to reflect folk tales and fairy tales. Women began to take center stage. Costumes were simplified into something closer to what we think of as ballet today, rather than aristocratic clothing. The training was vigorous and was usually performed by members of the working class, who devoted themselves not only to the art form, but to feeding their families. In her book Apollo's Angels, Jennifer Homan said, "Today, dancers take this new school for granted. Its steps, training, and forms constitute what we think of as classical ballet. Yet this technique and style of movement, this classical form, grew up in a distinctly, even violently, anti-classical movement." Music reveals an unknown kingdom to mankind, a world that has nothing in common with the outward, material world that surrounds it, and in which we leave behind all predetermined conceptual feelings in order to give ourselves up to the inexpressible. It wasn't long after the dust settled from the French Revolution that these words were written. And it's funny because this quote could easily be about the music Tchaikovsky composed for the Nutcracker. But in fact, this is the first critique written about Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and ironically by E.T.A. Hoffmann, the author of the Nutcracker and the Mouse King. Thanks to the ballet, the Nutcracker is regarded as a cozy Christmas tale, but Hoffmann's original novel is gloomy and dark. It also marks a different kind of revolution, an intellectual one. It's a treatise that society demands the loss of imagination as the price of adulthood, that retaining one's imagination can free the soul, but ignoring society comes at a terrible cost, the loss of friends and family, health and home, and maybe even your life. E.T.A. Hoffmann's Nutcracker was translated into French, and the dark tones of the story were softened a bit by Alexandre Dumas. It is most likely this version that was read by the French dancer and ballet master of the Russian Imperial Theater, Marius Petipa. Anxious to prove themselves as cultural as Europe, Russia built a strong ballet program of their own, although they continued to rely heavily on foreign artists, of which Petipa was one. Petipa arrived in Russia in 1847 with a one-year contract as a dancer. He fell in love with the country and would never leave. It's interesting to note that he never quite mastered the Russian language, but at the time it wasn't necessary, as most of his colleagues and the Russian royal family spoke French fluently. It was toward the end of his career that Petipa began working on the Nutcracker. The production was riddled with problems from the start. The first being that Tchaikovsky wasn't very enthusiastic about the project. That being said, by February 25th, 1891, Petipa had sent his instructions to Tchaikovsky, and Tchaikovsky had begun composing. On March 6, 1891, Tchaikovsky left on a tour of Paris and America, which means much of the Nutcracker was composed right here in the U.S. of A. Tchaikovsky continued to struggle with the score. He wasn't satisfied with his work and requested he be given more time. And then tragedy struck. Tchaikovsky's sister Alexandra died. The Nutcracker was delayed until the next season, while Tchaikovsky went into mourning. Rehearsals finally began in 1892, but again misfortune struck when Petipa's 15-year-old daughter, Yevgenia, was diagnosed with bone cancer. A promising young ballerina, she tragically tried to fight the cancer with an amputation of her leg. It could not save her life. She died on August 26, 1892. Distraught, Petipa withdrew from rehearsals and then fell ill, and his assistant took over. It's unknown if Petipa managed to choreograph any of the steps of the Nutcracker, but without a doubt he was responsible for the libretto and the stage direction. The Nutcracker premiered a week before Christmas at the Imperial Mariinsky Theater. However, it was not met with an enthusiastic response. Many felt that the transition from the real world to the magical world in the first act was too abrupt, and others criticized the fact that they had to wait until after midnight for the prima ballerina to perform the Sugar Plum Fairy variation in the second act. Many felt it lacked the serious storytelling or subject matter to even be considered a ballet, and one review said, "It's a pity that so much fine music is expended on nonsense unworthy of attention." In spite of its rocky reception, the Nutcracker continued to be revived off and on in Russia. And then, yet again, ballet was tossed on the waves of social change and immigration in the tumultuous years of the Russian Revolution. In 1924, during a visit to Germany, a group of Soviet state dancers fled to Paris. Amongst the group was George Balanchine, who soon after settled in the United States. Within his first 3 months here, he had established his own ballet school, the School of American Ballet. Balanchine's contribution to dance could fill a video of its own. For our purposes, Balanchine was very familiar with the Nutcracker, having danced the role of the Nutcracker Prince when he was a 15-year-old ballet student at the Mariinsky Theater. He wasn't the first to present the Nutcracker in America, but he was the first to dust off the story and present it with one of the greatest innovations of the mid-20th century, the television. After many failed attempts, Balanchine eventually started a company, the New York City Ballet, and with that company, on December 25th, 1958, he brought the first Nutcracker live from New York City into the living rooms of families across America in what was the first attempt to time shift a live color broadcast to the West Coast. Just as Louis XIV didn't invent ballet, George Balanchine didn't invent the Nutcracker, but ballet has always been more than just a sequence of complicated steps in space. It is a reflection of the people who have danced it. The Nutcracker is the product of the many imaginations that brought it to life, but also revolution, innovation, and immigration. And thus ballet, once intended for the entertainment of kings, became a means by which young people across America bring their communities together to celebrate, inviting them to believe in magic and to dream and to never extinguish the torch of imagination. I think E.T.A. Hoffmann would be proud.